On June 24th, a change is scheduled that most people have never heard about. It's not being talked about much in the mainstream tech news. In fact, most everyday users won't even know it exists until it affects them directly. But for millions of people around the world, it could quietly change how their computers start up, or whether they start at all. Some users may turn on their computer that morning and notice nothing strange. Others might see slower boot times or small warnings they ignore. But a portion of users could face something much more serious. Their computer may simply refuse to start normally, not because the hardware is broken, not because of a virus, but because something in the system that checks what is allowed to run when a computer starts may have changed. This is where a term called secure boot comes in. Secure boot is a built-in security system in modern computers. It runs before Windows, Linux, or any other operating system even loads. Its job is to make sure only trusted software is allowed to start the computer. If something is not approved or not recognized, the system can block it from running completely. Most people never interact with Secure Boot directly. They don't see it. They don't configure it. They may not even know it exists. But it is always working in the background on most modern machines. Now, the concern that has been spreading in technical communities is about a planned update to how Secure Boot rules are handled. According to official technical documents and discussions among developers, there's a change coming around June 24th that updates how certain boot components are trusted or blocked. These changes are being delivered through system updates and firmware security rules that operate at a very low level of the computer. For many Windows users, this update may pass without any visible impact. But for people who use Linux, either as their main operating system or alongside Windows, there is growing concern that some systems could be affected in unexpected ways. Linux is an alternative operating system used by developers, students, privacy-focused users, and many tech professionals. It often runs alongside Windows in a dual boot setup, where users choose which system to start when they turn on their computer. The worry in the Linux community is not just about a normal update, it's about whether changes in secure boot rules could interfere with the way Linux starts on certain machines, especially if older boot components are involved. This has led to confusion, debate, and a lot of technical discussion online. Some developers say it is a routine security improvement. Others believe it could create serious compatibility problems for a large number of users. What makes this situation important is not just the technical detail, but the fact that most affected users may not realize anything is changing until they restart their system and find that something no longer works the way it used to. Before we go deeper into who might be affected and what can actually be done, it's important to understand how this system works and why such a small technical change can have such a large impact. To understand why the situation is getting so much attention, you first need to understand what Secure Boot really is doing inside your computer. Secure Boot is part of something called UEFI firmware. This is the very first software that runs when you press the power button. It starts before Windows, before Linux, before anything else. Its job is to prepare the hardware and decide what is allowed to load next. Think of it like a security checkpoint at an airport. Before anything is allowed to board, it has to be checked and approved. Secure Boot works by using digital signatures. These are like encrypted approval stamps. If a piece of software, like a bootloader or operating system, has a valid signature, the computer allows it to run. If it doesn't match the approved list, the system can block it completely. In theory, this is meant to protect users. It helps prevent certain types of malware that try to attack a system before the operating system even starts. These attacks are rare but serious, so the idea behind Secure Boot is considered a strong security measure. But the real issue begins with one key question. Who controls what counts as trusted? On most personal computers, especially Windows-based machines, the answer is not the user. It is the hardware manufacturer working with Microsoft's certificate system. Microsoft plays a central role in managing which software signatures are trusted by default on most consumer PCs. This is where Linux enters the picture. Linux is not one single product. It is a family of operating systems created by different communities and organizations. Because it is open source and independent, it does not automatically come signed in the same way Windows does. To solve this, Linux distributions use a special tool called shim. Shim is a small boot program that is signed in a way Secure Boot accepts. Once shim starts, it then loads the actual Linux system. For years, this system has worked as a kind of bridge. It allows Linux to run on Secure Boot machines without turning security off completely. It's a compromise between open systems and tightly controlled boot security. But now, that bridge is at the center of concern. According to technical updates and security documentation, a new enforcement layer is being introduced into Secure Boot policies. This system adds extra checks that can block older or specific boot components, even if they were previously accepted. This is important because many Linux systems still rely on shim versions that were built years ago, If those versions are included in the new restriction list, then certain Linux installations may fail to start after the update is applied. From the user's perspective, the result is simple and frustrating. The computer turns on, but Linux does not load. Instead, it may show an error or fail silently. For someone who doesn't understand what changed, it can look like their operating system suddenly broke for no reason. At the same time, it's also important to be fair about what the companies involved are saying. From their point of view, this update is about security. Some older boot components have known vulnerabilities, and updating the rules helps close those gaps. So there are two truths happening at once. One side sees this as a necessary security improvement. The other side sees it as a risk to system independence and compatibility. Both perspectives come from real concerns, and that is what makes the situation complicated rather than simple. The key point is this: even small changes at the boot level can have large effects because they sit underneath everything else on the computer. They decide what is allowed to start before the operating system even has a chance to respond. When people hear about something like this, it's easy to assume it only affects a small group of tech experts. But the real situation is much larger than that. Linux is used by millions of people around the world. Some use it as their main operating system. Others use it alongside Windows in a dual boot setup. Many more use it indirectly through servers, development tools, and work environments. Estimates suggest tens of millions of people are using Linux in some form on personal computers today, and that number has been rising over time. The reason for that growth is simple. More users are becoming unhappy with how mainstream operating systems are changing. Things like stricter hardware requirements, mandatory online accounts, built-in tracking features, and heavy system updates have pushed some users to look for alternatives. Linux often appeals to those users because it offers more control, more transparency, and more flexibility. You can choose how your system works, what runs on it, and how it behaves. But that flexibility still depends on one critical thing. The computer must be able to start it, and that is exactly why secure boot matters in this discussion. Most users never think about what happens when they press the power button. They expect their operating system to load, just like it always has. But under the surface, there is a chain of trust that decides whether that system is allowed to run. If something in that chain changes, even slightly, it can affect how the entire system behaves. This is where concerns about the June 24th update begin to grow. Linux users who run dual boot systems are especially sensitive to changes like this. In a dual boot setup, Windows and Linux share the same hardware. Windows handles system updates, while Linux runs separately on its own partitions. If a secure boot policy update is delivered through Windows and then enforced at the firmware level, it can affect the way both operating systems are validated during startup. That means a change intended for security purposes in Windows can still influence how Linux starts, even though Linux is a separate system. This is what makes the situation unusual. It's not a traditional software update that only affects one program. It operates at a deeper level that sits below all operating systems. Because of that, even experienced users are paying attention closely, not because they believe computers will suddenly stop working everywhere, but because changes at this level are difficult to predict in every possible hardware setup. There's also a communication gap that is added to the concern. Many Linux users say they only became aware of the June 24th change through developer discussions, technical forums, and reverse engineering of update notes, not through clear, direct messaging aimed at end users. From their perspective, that creates uncertainty. If an update can affect whether a system boots or not, users want to know clearly and early enough to prepare. On the other hand, from the security perspective, companies often frame these updates as routine maintenance, necessary steps to improve protection against real threats that exist in the boot process. So again, two viewpoints exist at the same time. One side sees this as a normal security improvement happening in the background. The other side sees it as a change that could disrupt real users without enough warning. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, but the impact depends heavily on each user's setup. And that leads to the most important question. What actually happens if your system is affected? And what can you do about it? So what actually happens if your system is affected on or after June 24th? For most people, nothing noticeable will change. Their computers will start normally. Windows will load, and daily use will continue without interruption. That is the most likely outcome for the majority of users. But for a smaller group, mainly people running Linux in certain configurations, the situation could be different. If a system depends on an older boot component that is no longer accepted under the updated secure boot policy, the computer may stop loading Linux correctly. In simple terms, the machine powers on, but the operating system does not start as expected. Instead of seeing the normal desktop, a user might see a boot error screen or a message indicating that something in the startup process has failed. For someone who is not familiar with secure boot or system internals, this can look like a sudden, unexplained breakdown. The important point is this: in most cases, nothing is physically wrong with the computer. The issue is about permission rules during startup, not damaged hardware. That also means it is often fixable, but the fix depends on the situation. For users who prepare in advance, the risk can be reduced significantly. The most important step is making sure the Linux system is fully updated before the policy change takes effect. Modern Linux distributions regularly release updates to their boot components to stay compatible with secure boot changes. Another important step is keeping a full backup of important files. This is not just for this specific situation, but as a general safety practice whenever system-level changes are happening. Some users may also choose to adjust their secure boot settings manually in the firmware. This can allow Linux to boot without relying on certain verification steps, but it also reduces some of the built-in security protections. It is a trade-off, and not every user will want or need to do this. In more technical setups, advanced users can use custom keys to sign their own boot components. This gives full control, but it requires a higher level of knowledge and careful setup. If a system does fail to boot after the update, recovery is usually possible using a live USB drive. This is a separate bootable system that can run independently and allow access to files, repairs, or updates that restore normal startup behavior. So while the situation sounds alarming at first, it is not necessarily permanent or destructive. It is more about compatibility between changing security rules and older system components. But beyond the technical steps, there is a larger question that this situation raises. Modern computers are built on layers of trust: hardware, firmware, and software all working together. When one layer changes the rules, it can affect everything above it. That is why events like this feel significant to some users. Not because computers are randomly breaking, but because control over the very first stage of startup, the boot process, has become centralized in a way that most users never see directly. For some people, that is an acceptable trade-off for better security and standardization. For others, it raises concerns about independence, choice, and long-term flexibility. Both perspectives exist, and both are part of the modern computing reality. And that is the full picture: a low-level security update, a widely used alternative operating system, and a system architecture where small changes can have large consequences.